Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled ScrewModifier. The ScrewModifier is quite similar to the edit mode spin and screw tools described in earlier video tutorials. The major difference is that now that it is available as a modifier rather than an edit mode tool, it becomes part of the modifier stack and can in turn have other modifiers added to it in sequence. To demonstrate the ScrewModifier, I have a blank Blender scene. In top view, I will add a simple circle mesh object. I will rotate the circle 90 degrees around the x-axis by pressing the R key, followed by the X key, followed by 90, and then enter. I will click on the modifier icon located in the Properties editor and add a ScrewModifier. By default, the ScrewModifier spins the object around the z-axis. The pivot location is, by default, the object's origin or center point. I'll zoom in a bit. I'll switch the axis from z to x. And I'll set the angle of revolution to 90 degrees. As you can see, the circle object is spun around itself 90 degrees, creating a split sphere effect. Notice also the dark faces. This is a result of the face normals being turned inside out. I can remove this effect by checkmarking the Calc Order checkbox, which calculates the order of the edges, in effect reorienting the face normals to the outside. Setting the angle of revolution to 180 degrees creates, in effect, a spun sphere-type object. Now, usually when using the spin modifier, an object, like an empty object, is used to determine the pivot location rather than using the default object origin. I'll remove the ScrewModifier from the circle object by clicking on the X in the ScrewModifier panel. I'll then go to Top View and snap my cursor to the circle object. I will then add an empty object and name the empty ScrewEmpty. I will then move the empty to the left of the circle object. I'll then select the circle object and add a ScrewModifier. I'll click in the Axis Object box and select the ScrewEmpty object as the pivot axis. Note that the circle has now been spun around the empty object the default 360 degrees. I'll checkmark the Calc Order to reorient the spun faces. By default, the number of steps in the revolution is set to 16. I'll increase this setting to 32. This produces a nice, smooth, torus-shaped object. This steps control refers to the steps in the 3D display. I'll also set the rendering steps to 32 so that when rendered, the object will have the same smooth appearance. At this point, the ScrewModifier is a good replacement for Blender's Edit Mode Spin tool. Since this is a modifier rather than an edit mode tool, the original circle mesh is still available for editing. I'll tab into edit mode. With all the circle vertices selected, I'll scale them down a bit. I'll then tab out of edit mode. The torus tube is now scaled down. I can increase or decrease the diameter of the torus by selecting the empty object, which serves as a pivot plane, and move it along the x-axis. I'll switch to front view. I'll reselect the circle object, and in the ScrewModifier panel, checkmark the Object Screw checkbox. This allows the object to be repositioned along the z-axis in a screw-like fashion. I'll select the empty object and move it up along the z-axis. Note that the mesh is now screwed around the empty object. I will reselect the circle object. By default, the number of iterations in the ScrewModifier panel is set to 1. I'll increase this to 4. We now have a spring-like object, with the diameter of the spring adjusted by the x movement of the empty object, and the distance between each coil determined by the z movement of the empty object. Besides springs and screw-type objects, the screw modifier is commonly used to model rope-like twisted objects. I'll go to Layer 2 and to Front View. Here I have modeled a double circular-shaped object, which I have named Rope Circle. I'll tab into Edit Mode to give you a better idea of the structure. Note that I have flattened out the circular shape a bit along the z-axis. I'll tab out of Edit Mode. Since this object has a double wing-like shape, I've also added an empty object at the rope circle's origin point so that the screw and spin actions occur about this pivot plane. I've named the empty Rope Empty. With the rope circle object selected, I'll add a screw modifier. I'll select the Rope Empty as the axis object. I will also checkmark Object Screw. I'll select the Rope Empty object and move it up a bit along the z-axis, forming a rope twist. I'll then select the Rope Circle object and increase the iteration to 12. We now have a rope-like object. I'll refine this a bit by adding to the Rope Circle object a subsurf modifier. I'll set the View and Render subdivisions to 2. This creates a nice, smooth, rope-like object.